Hey everybody, this is AOMISHOT22. I'm just gonna jump into a few tables at 200 zoom on stars. I don't know, I'm just kind of gonna fucking click some buttons and see what happens. Um, uh, yeah, we'll see what happens. As far as like the king five, like optimally this hand is actually mixing three bet and fold and shit. I don't really have a lot of information about my opponent. Seems to be on the slightly aggressive side at the 40 big blind stack. The king eight against the roughly 5x three bet, just mixing four bet and fold with this combination. On the 10-9-7, like it's kind of weird when you start discussing hands because when you really consider like there's so many variables in these situations, and I could just like talk about like equilibrium play, like blind versus blind, and this texture and whatnot, but it almost seems like somewhat of a disservice. Turn just pitching. Seems like a somewhat of a disservice in some senses. Like when I see a lot of the training videos that are out there, and it's just like live play, and there's very little depth. There's very little discussion about like the actual situation, the equilibriums that exist, sort of how people are likely to end up deviating, and then as a result, how we can end up. I just roll very high here. I'm having very few cold calls, but I'm playing the occasional cold call and the cutoff. Not particularly frequent. High is going to be the more passive option. Um, it's kind of like a bit of a complicated discussion on the turn here, but essentially we have about like 6% trips. And in terms of, see, it's difficult to talk about these things like in terms of the amount of protection we're playing. Oh, like, okay, I wish I just had like more time to. River, I roll a bit high. I'm playing check. Basically, there's a bunch of like protection-y hands that are going on. Oh man, I kind of want to sit out actually and just discuss these two hands because every single hand there's just a lot of stuff going on. As well as like River, if he doesn't have queens in his check back range enough, and he doesn't slow play enough queen 10 on the turn, which queen 10 is going to be one of his most frequent. I think the issue with like Geo here is that this is like incredibly loose. The issue is that like when you okay, we'll discuss this hand. We'll discuss both of these hands because everything I want to say is like predicated on certain things, and I can't fucking do a goddamn two tabling video without like going in extreme depth and talking about each individual hand. You can say like things are standard. This makes sense for your range. That makes sense for your range. How you do that and how you do this, but it's so difficult. Like obviously, I could literally just sit here and say like, okay, we're on the fucking turn. We have some hands that want to be going on the large side. We can't go too large because our opponent just has so much 10x, and his 10x will end up raising. So we don't need to go like massive with our nuts because we'll just get our nuts in anyways in some way. The most important part of our range here is our checking range, obviously, because of the fact that basically so many of our hands end up just having like a decent percentage of the pot, like 8%, 15%. Like the most important part of our range here is our checks on the turn. The probing range is kind of like whatever. Turn is going to be a mixed strategy with this particular combo. The thing is, I don't really give a fuck about my actual hand. It just means nothing to me. I'm just thinking about like how we can actually generate EV range versus range optimally in terms of like the 10-8-2. So the deuce is going to be a card that is like quite disadvantaged for him. We end up obviously having just more suited deuce X. In addition to that, we end up having a few more sets than him, assuming that we're playing perfectly GTO pre-flop strategies as far as him. Well, maybe actually very similar. We have more two pairs. It's a spot where he actually needs to play like not too aggressively on the flop. And I would say that with the metagame, he's probably just like playing a strategy where he's trying to deny equity too often. And maybe like c betting a few too many good things and checking some hands that are a little bit too weak or like sort of Broadway ace high heavy in terms of the actual like UTG range here, which is like roughly 18% or so. When you look at an 18% range, what is this math here? We're looking at like call it like 220 combos, or like no, about like 200 odd combos by the time you remove the 5 cards that we have: the Jack, the 9, the 10, the 2, the 8, the next 10. Um, so when you consider like what this actual range is in terms of like pre-flop broadways, he doesn't have so many like the Jack 10, the Queen 10, the King 10. A lot of those are pitching pre. Uh, his range is like quite Broadway heavy. But then in addition to that, when you think about like the amount of ace highs that end up, just checking back, something like ace 9 of hearts, ace 6 of diamonds, blah blah blah, ace jack. He's very, very, very ace high Broadway heavy, and this is not equilibrium. This is just like how often people are going to be constructing their ranges as far as like optimal strategy here, range versus range. When you consider like constructing a range, first of all, as far as like the 10x, you can definitely like start using larger sizings, but you just generally don't want to be like piling in loads of money when the advantages are like very slightly in our favor, especially in a situation where like by river you can kind of like stick in enough money anyways. I think that like focusing our range in terms of the betting portion, I think the most important element of this is going to be to deny equity, especially if you consider that our opponent is maybe very slightly weaker than he's supposed to be optimally, and potentially is also not finding enough of the bluff thin raises as well that are supposed to be happening at equilibrium, and actually shifts the EVs to like really wanting us to stick quite a few small bets in here on the turn for equity denial, and obviously just kind of like pushing this quote unquote advantage when we end up betting and he calls, we have more equity than 50%, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a little bit complicated. In addition to that, like we can piggyback these hands off of the 10x that we'll be deciding to go with the small bet. River's a little bit more complicated. It's not really a big deal, but essentially like so much of our range is just like shit hands, and we unblock a 10 that's going to be betting. The queen is one of the most advantaged cards for him, so because he's actually like having a bunch of queen x of spades on the turn. He also has in absolute shit ton of like ace queen and a touch of the king queen as well. Um, my river range for betting, I'm playing not a GTO strategy here, because the thing is that like optimally when you look at rangers, there's so many things that are going on. Like if I bet too often, he has, oh man, see, this stuff is like very complicated. Um, if I always check the nuts, he would obviously like never bet a queen, right? If I decided to like, and then of course if I always check the nuts, then he makes a bunch of EV with the hands that want to show down. Like essentially by developing a betting range, we're kind of like trying to take every single part of the game tree on the river here. It's like we're kind of taking a little and then we're kind of giving a little. And essentially we're trying to take as much EV away from his range as possible with our range. At the same time, while not boosting certain hands in his range, right? Obviously. Um, because of the fact that on river, our range, and I mean, I'm fucking betting turn with some deuce X here, with some threes, and probably at a higher frequency than optimal. Again, because I think it makes his life more difficult on the turn. It sort of forces him to put in a bunch of bluff raises, forces him to put in to float more often than he's probably going to end up floating. He needs to be calling this turn like 90% of the time or more, and raising relatively frequently as well. I think I just make his life more difficult by playing such an aggressive turn probing strategy for small here. That being coupled with the fact, now by the way, once he ends up calling as well, he clearly needs slow plays. In addition to the slow plays, he actually might even have a touch of the slow plays of the pocket 10s on the flop, of the pocket 8s, very low frequency. Essentially, this is more so on the high, like on something like a 10-8-2 board, the equity of something like pocket 8s is so stupidly high that it just makes a lot of sense to start betting very, very, very frequently, unless you're attempting to counter an opponent that is, I mean, okay, but we don't need to talk about the counters as far as like turn probe, whatever stuff. But this versus like 10-8-5 two-tone, the equities of like pocket 8s, very, very, very different, especially versus the continuing ranges. So he's got much more incentive to be continuation betting sets, which is basically the point. Doesn't have two pairs, obviously. When we end up betting the turn so small, I think that it's a node where our opponent is going to sort of like lack the slow plays that are very necessary and very clear. And in addition to that, potentially Well, yeah, I mean, I basically think he's going to end up lacking the slow plays. Uh, yeah. And the slow plays, what are the slow plays? The slow plays are 10x, and obviously the overpairs are just not a raise pretty much almost ever, but they certainly can be at a very low frequency. And it's not about like, oh, let's raise overpair X% of the time. It's like thinking about what this range is trying to accomplish, what his range is trying to accomplish versus our range, and who has the advantages and how he makes EV. He doesn't really accomplish a whole lot raising stuff like pocket queens on the turn. He'd do a hell of a lot, like nines. Actually, denies a bit more equity, and it's like sort of like a mergey thing. I mean, it's not really a merge in this particular situation, but because I'm not actually folding better, so by definition, it's not actually a merge against a raise. But yeah, I mean, it's just a more efficient combo to be raised. My point is, I don't think he has very many slow played queens. I don't think he has very many slow played 10x. Once he ends up getting to the river, Jack 9 is just the absolute nuts. Now, obviously, if he knows that we're sticking in all the money in various situations with like very marginal hands in terms of like SPR to the potential combos that we should be having, he can increase his EV if I don't change my strategy, if I stick to this crazy strategy of going all in with marginal hands, he can increase his EV by finding more slow plays. And of course, he exponentially increases, not like absurdly increases EV, but he can make a bit more EV with his range if he finds more slow plays versus people like me, right? And I'm not even doing this very frequently. It's like a very spot dependent thing. See, this is why I can't actually make a video because like fucking, I've played for 2 minutes. I want to talk about the other hand as well. We've talked about this hand for already about 10 minutes. However, I don't think I don't think I'm doing a service to anybody if I just play hands and click buttons. However, if that's what viewers want to see, I'm also happy to do that, but there would be absolutely no depth. It would be like be saying, well, this is a thing, this is a thing, this is a thing, this is predicated on this. I don't even know if I'd be able to go in that much depth. But by river, in order for me to be able to show down stuff like eights, stuff like deuce X, all this kind of stuff, and him not just be able to blindly value bet something like 9-8 on the river because of the fact that my entire range is going to be weaker than an 8, clearly I have to have check raises on the river, right? That's called optimal poker. That's called equilibria. In order to, because, I mean, really, we're focusing so much on making as much EV as we can on the river. We're trying to actually get to showdown with these shit hands. If our opponent decides to reopen the river too frequently, why in God's name would we decide to bet a good hand? Well, we wouldn't, obviously. We would just check it. But then if he knows that we're just going to check good hands, then our opponent is not going to be value betting very thinly. Actually, he wouldn't even be betting a queen, right? If we're betting a 10 very frequently on the turn because it's not a spot that he's going to delay particularly often, that is more exploitative stuff because, again, equilibrium stuff, he would actually be delaying turn just at the right frequency, right? But I think that in this situation, he would delay a little bit less often than he should, and then it kind of like pushes some of our hands into probing a little bit more often than not. Again, all these kind of things, and again, I use the RNG on the river. I'm not 100% checking this, obviously. I'm just trying to play a very tough strategy versus my opponents, right? I'm trying to make their life very difficult. I'm trying to put them in nodes of the game tree where they're uncomfortable with, and even if they're not uncomfortable, just play tougher strategies than other people. When I go into a micro stakes forum and I see people talk about hands, they don't ever discuss strategy because they're obviously whales. But it's not because they're whales. It's because they don't understand. Like, you can't just fucking look at some stupid ace king hand and say, should I fold against the 5 bet or should I not? Like, pretty much people at 25 NL, 50 NL, even 100 NL are not even capable of considering talking about strategies whatsoever. Pretty much the only things that they're able to talk about are just like pain and then pain and then pain and then bragging about something that they did that probably wasn't even that good anyways, but magically worked out, and then more pain. Like, in terms of improving in poker, and then, you have a lot of people that are like afraid of like trying to understand how poker works. I by no means try to play balanced in almost any situation. I'm constantly deviating from like what I think, and sorry that I'm going on this rant, but literally I was just doing a stream the other day, and people were like, oh, why do you try to play balanced? I never try to play balanced. I'm literally in this situation on the turn. I'm specifically playing a very different strategy than what the equilibrium strategy is because I think my opponents are deviating. And I also think that my opponents are probably like 200 NL players are not Obviously, you have like some very strong 200 players because some of them are like mixing 1K and 500 zoom, especially when the game isn't running. Then they're coming in at 200. Those guys are tough. Your average 200 regular is very weak, incredibly weak. So, like, sort of targeting these guys, I mean, to play balance would be absolutely atrocious. One thing I want to say as well, excuse me, is that, like, okay, if you put these guys against a GTO bot, let's say they lose like 5 BB 100. Let's say they lose 4 BB 100, something like that. Maybe 3, maybe 6. I'm not sure. It depends on like how much of a field player they are, but I don't think that any regular in the pool is ever going to lose more than like 7 BB 100 versus a GTO bot. If they are, then they're very fundamentally bad. There aren't very many people that are beating 200 that are absolutely atrocious fundamentally. But of course, my assumptions could be wrong. If you put them against someone who's like good at exploiting them, they're going to get raped for fucking 15 BB 100 every single fucking day of the week, if not more. Now, obviously, that's very different, right? Now, why is that? Well, because the GTO bot, regardless of your bluffing frequency, regardless of how imbalanced you are, the GTO bot is just going to play perfectly, right? GTO, it's never going to adjust, so it's never going to be able to, like, really counter you. It's just playing a lot of different equilibrias that make EV based off of your mistakes, but they don't actually explicitly just like try to make more EV because of the fact that you're deviating here. Like to attempt to play balance in these games would be terrible, beyond terrible, because as well people don't even consider like a oh man, I don't know. This stuff is complicated, and honestly, I was supposed to be doing a play video. Let's check out the other hand. I'm actually running slightly low on energy. I'm running like very slightly low on energy because I've just done a bunch of talking. I almost want to take like a little break and then get back to this. Yeah, I mean, I'm having a few flats in cutoff. People will say, "Oh, don't flat because of the rate." You know, the EV is so similar. Fuck off. Doesn't matter. If people tell you have to do this or have to do that, they have no idea what they're talking about because everything works in poker for the most part, and poker's really about like sticking your opponents in situations they're very uncomfortable with. I think people defend against 3-bets really, really well in these games. Actually, they don't. They don't even play pre-flop well. If you look at a population and you look at like GTO versus them, they're playing very poorly. But the thing is, their opponents aren't necessarily exploiting them for that. This would be another thing is, oh man, see, I could go on another like 10-minute rant about pre-flop. I'll make it short, but in a situation like where I go to like 15, now let's say I go to like $18 here, right? And he's supposed to fold like almost 70% of his range. Call it 65% of his range with the rake and everything. And he doesn't 4-bet enough, but he decides to call too often. So when you look at like the EVs in a GTO solver, all these EVs are predicated on the fact that you're actually playing this correct calling range. When you start calling more, obviously your EV is lower. So you're already not like playing well and this is very complicated. But in addition to that, and of course like pre-flop is run backwards. So really just like, you know, doing it. Oh man, it's complicated. I don't want to go in a big rant, but essentially even pre-flop, these people fuck up. But I think, you know, when you have like training videos, like, oh, I only play a 3-better fold strategy here, this or that or that, that's perfectly fine. But it's also perfectly fine to like develop cold call this way. It doesn't really matter as long as you're playing these different situations well. I don't think that like there are some rigs that are like in position using 2.5. Now, actually, that's a very dominated strategy because you're literally just donating your opponent free EV by going too small. Like people that are going like 2.2, 2.1 on the button, you're donating your opponent just free EV with the more marginal hands. So that is one of the problems with that. But then if you think you're making it back in some other area by your opponent making more mistakes, that's essentially the logic. When you're playing better players, it's hard to actually think that. I mean, playing optimally tends to make more sense. But okay, we cold call here. Our opponent from MP, roughly 23% of hands, roughly 50% broadways. You're looking at 160 combos of broadways versus about a 300. Actually, it's about a 270 combo range. Obviously, minus the jacks, minus my cards, blah, blah, blah. Like, a little bit less than 50% broadways. So it's a smashing board for him. This is complicated stuff, man. Again, because everything has to do with equilibrias. But I'm playing a very balanced calling range. I'm not too Broadway heavy. I'm not too pair heavy. I'm playing a very, very, very balanced cold calling range here. And I mean, essentially, if I stab here too often, there are counters. If I don't stab here enough, there are counters. If I go very small here on the flop, I'm challenging my opponent to actually do something. I'm literally trying to deny equity with certain hands. When you consider my actual range and the EV of my range on this board texture, the equity, the nut advantages, blah, blah, blah. When you consider all this, when you think about the fact that what my opponent's counter is if I'm stabbing here too often, and I'm not stabbing that much more often, but in terms of the multiple different bet sizings and this and that and whatever, yes, of course we can use larger bet sizings. Absolutely. But there's just a lot of stuff going on range versus range, and putting your opponents in if you're not betting here too frequently, but you are using a very small sizing, you're losing just a sliver of a motherfucking sliver of EV. Actually, it's a little bit more than a sliver if your opponent is playing perfectly in all the nodes after this. But when you end up going more deep than this, and you think about how they're reacting, and you think, oh yeah, it's complicated. I don't even really want to go that much in depth here. Obviously, turn's a bit weird in the sense that, well, yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of hands that are going geometric. In terms of his actual continues, he should have a touch of the 10-8 out of MP, but not very much. It's just a very good card for my range. We're quite concentrated toward the pocket eights. We have a bunch of hands that want to go all in. But it's a good sizing for our range. We have multiple sizings that happen here on the turn, and this is just going to be part of a slew of sizings. Yeah, I'm going to take a break, and I'll do some more live play. Thing is, I just haven't done much live play recently because I see one hand, and then I want to stop and talk about it for 10, 15, 20 minutes. By the way, I rushed through these two hands. I could go in much more depth. Much more depth. But I'm trying to get some play in as well. So I'll pause this and I'll come back. Okay, I've just thrown the tables back on. Actually, ace-9 and pure fold. The kings... 3-betting as well. For some reason, I see a lot of micro stakes players using very, very small 3-bets. Very bad strategy. Their rationalization seems to be that they don't want to ISO themselves against stronger hands. I roll a bit on the higher side. Actually, range versus range, this hand is going to be bet quite often for quite large. Now, okay, this is complicated as well. I'm going to discuss this hand. See, every single hand, there's so much depth. Fucking hell. Every single hand. And I can't really explain it while I'm in game. Because, I mean, it's just not an easy thing to discuss. Turn, we actually end up blocking some of the hands that are betting. We also have a number of hands that just want to deny equity. Some of the 10s, the jacks, the queens, the kings that decided to bet. Though it is a pretty high frequency turn check. In addition to that, I think my opponent is very often going to be... Okay. This isn't really so much of a thing here. This honestly is a decent amount to do with my... let me see. My opponent. Oh, man. Yeah, I need to kind of just discuss this hand after. Okay. Huh. Where do we even begin with this hand? We begin from pre-flop, but pre-flop's a bit interesting. Pre-flop, if you look at pre-flop ranges, when we end up going 5x. Oh yeah. Okay. Even before what I was trying to say about micro stakes players going 3.5, 4, 4.5, even 5x is a touch small. But versus cutoff, it actually ends up being okay. But 5.5, 6x would actually be slightly better. But then I'm just a little bit more confused about what range I'm up against. But in terms of making EV with your big blind range, clearly 5.5, 6x is superior to 4, 4.5. You don't want people to call you, by the way. If you have this fear about people folding all the worse hands and continuing the better hands. That's what they're supposed to do. When you have something like ace, when you have literally any hand that you 3-bet, you just want them to fold. Obviously, if you have exactly aces or kings, and then maybe queens, depending on the situation, and the rake situation as well, there are a lot of various factors. Maybe you want them to call. Probably with lower stakes, you just want them to fold in general. Your EV is going to be higher for people to be folding than to be continuing when you have like jacks or ace king, right? You want them to fold. That's such a incredibly large misconception when I hear people say, "Oh, if we go too big, they're going to..." No, that's just not true. That's just not how poker works. That's just an idea in people's head. That's not math. That's not logic. That's not EV. That's just a story that makes people feel better, but it's actually not how you generate EV with your big blind range. So if you're 3-betting from 4x and you rationalize some fucking stupid shit like, "Oh, da 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 da," no, don't do that. Just like play a good strategy. Because the thing is like I was just saying, oh, you can do whatever and it doesn't matter. But you don't want to play strategies that are dominated. It's such a dominated strategy. You lose so much EV by going too small, especially in high rate games. It's fucking terrible. That's one thing I want to say. Okay. Moving on. Pre-flop. Okay. Pre-flop, our opponent is supposed to be folding a very high frequency of the lower pairs. People just way overcall to 3-bets, man. Like, way overcall to 3-bets in low stakes. They cannot adjust to variables. They think that a 4x 3-bet and a 5x 3-bet are very close. They're not fucking close at all. By the way, our range is supposed to be like relatively polar out of the big blind, and as a result of that, our opponent gets to call a little bit more often. And actually, it's more than a little bit more often, but the reason why I say it's a little bit more often and not like a bit more often is because of the fact that essentially when you look at like population analysis, it's very easy for the big blind to end up like missing some of the sort of like 3-bet, I'm using air quotes here, I know you can't see, but I'm using them, bluffs of like queen 6 suited, king 3 suited. It's a polarized range, okay? But people miss them. So, again, this stuff is all complicated, but people are calling too wide in position against 3-bets. In addition to that, they're like very concentrated toward lower pairs. When you're constructing a range pre-flop, you don't want to be stupidly concentrated toward anything. Obviously, your opponent is just smashing you on certain boards then, and while you could say, "Oh, I'm getting a discounted price pre-flop. The only thing I need to do is do better than losing like the amount of money that I put in so I can call with anything." No. That's actually true. But the thing is that in order to maximize the EV of your range, you can't just have every single card in the deck, or else every single card in your range EV reduces like a motherfucker. Like, there's just so many misconceptions that are going on. And the thing is, I didn't even think people thought like this until I started playing 200 recently again. And I realized that the regs just do not have a motherfucking clue how to play. Not the tougher regs, by the way. Not the guys that are playing 500, but they as well are not very strong fundamentally. But I don't want to talk shit about them because the thing is, they do very good at exploiting fish. They're just strong as far as like being a poker player is concerned in terms of like bankroll management, mental game, being disciplined and putting in the hours, studying, right? So maybe they're very good at like being a poker player. Maybe in terms of like actual strategy, they have like some very large blind spots and they're like very predictable. But that being said, that's whatever. I didn't give a fuck about them. I'm talking about like your average 200 regular who's like very weak and does not adjust to variables whatsoever. On flop, 8-5-3, essentially like we obviously have an equity advantage. However, the thing is that in position has like more sets, and he has more sets at equilibrium, right? Again, he's calling more 3s and 5s and 8s than he's supposed to. 8s is supposed to be folding at a mixed frequency pre-flop, clearly. And if you don't know this, you should start to think about pre-flop. If you don't know how to play pre-flop, it's very important to get pre-flop down correctly. I'm still working on pre-flop. I still run pre-flop sims. Most of it is exploitative stuff and trying to figure out like how I can exploit fish and how I can do this and that. But it's very important. And maybe I don't necessarily run them too often, but I have a friend that does, and we've done some stuff together. Mostly he's just fucking taught me everything. I'm actually a whale. But moving on. Okay. Now, optimally, when you think about like, oh, how do I construct a range? Well, do you need board coverage on this card? Do you need board coverage on that card? It's very, very, very complicated when you're considering constructing a range on like 853. I could repeat just random outputs and it would mean nothing. But essentially, we're absolutely like, what's the advantage here? We have this very large overpair advantage, aces to tens, though he should have tens and jacks at a reasonable frequency, but whatever, okay? We're doing very well in that region. Now, it actually is a higher EV board for him if he's playing his range correctly pre-flop, which I doubt that he is. It's also supposed to, and that's another key thing, but again, it's just too much time to spend on those things. But yeah, higher EV board for him because of the nut advantage. It's higher equity for me. The EV should run like very close, but I think it's slightly higher for him just given how stupidly set heavy he's supposed to actually end up being compared to be, or what he's likely to have. So, okay, all of these things, and my range is incredibly Broadway heavy, especially if I 3-bet a little bit more linear as a counter to people that are potentially not continuing enough. By the way, my sort of like bet small on turn and bet small on the river is just completely retarded for the most part, but it's done for like very specific reasons against this individual who's like very passive, generally on the weaker side. It's a strategy that I don't care about kings, right? I'm considering how to like make EV with the rest of my range, the sort of like queens, the jacks, the tens, trying to actually challenge him to find enough bluff raises with some of those. But in terms of like the flop play, yes. This hand is going to be betting fairly frequently. In terms of like when you actually end up checking, basically we have just too many overcards and we can't bet all of our good hands. And yeah, when we're going big, our opponent needs to call really frequently. He needs to like make the EV of like betting some of our like random quote unquote bluffs, and checking like the same EV, right? And he needs to be calling very frequently. It's really just a function of equity realization, but that doesn't really matter. I think that's a different subject, and I don't even necessarily understand that deeply anyway, so I don't really want to go into it. But yeah, in terms of like in our check calls, right? As long as we have like reasonable board coverage here, it doesn't really matter if we like decide to check calls some shit like ace king, ace queen, some ace jack of diamonds, blah blah blah. And by the way, we're just betting very frequently, and the majority of our checking range is just going to be overcards. But because of the fact that our range is so overcard heavy, we don't just get to check like just overcards, right? In order to force him to actually have checkbacks and not go like 15% pot and deny equity and kind of like make our overcards indifferent on the flop, we have to include some overpairs in our checking range, right? Otherwise, he could just stab very, very small, 13, 15% pot every single time and make our life absolute misery. So because of that, we do stick some overpairs into our checking range. Not a particularly high frequency. We have the King of Hearts, which kind of like, I mean, it doesn't really, blockers are not really that big of a deal. So you could say, well, you have a little bit more equity in the checking range and, you're not really so scared of like things shifting and, oh, if he has, I don't know, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Honestly, the heart blockers are just such a micro detail. I wouldn't even worry about anything like that. People focus on blocker things and shit, like myself as well. I fucking focus on the shit and it doesn't matter. It's really just considering range versus range. Just focusing on a blocker would be completely retarded here. Okay. So, honestly, I kind of just want to get to playing. Like, Turn and River's like very specific about this individual, and I have some reads on him, and I don't really want to discuss how I think this guy is playing because I want to continue to exploit him. So I'm actually just going to shut the fuck up because part of my rule for making videos is I just don't give away any more shit about individual players. Because this is not a GTO thing on Turn and River, by the way. Really, Turn, we're kind of just going absolutely massive, right? And we're using like the Queen Jack that block his most frequent King X to do it, like Queen Jack of Spades, something like that to be bluffing, and we'd like round it out with something like the aces and the ace king and the king queen sort of stuff, right? That would make a bunch of EV here, and then this hand is one of the hands that actually is in our checking range, so he doesn't just get to like bet like king 10 turn river all in every single time, which you could do it anyways. But like, I mean, it's fine anyways with that particular hand. But you're sort of getting the point. Like there are certain hands that want to like protect themselves. But again, this guy is like a passive whale nit, so I don't want to go into it with this guy. Okay, I'm gonna pause video, gonna get some water, and I'll get back into it. Okay, I've got some water. I've taken a piss. We're back. So as far as like the 7 and 4, we're doing quite well. We're also going to end up like having an advantage just on like all the flushing cards as far as like range versus range. In addition, like here on this turn, there's just no protection that's required whatsoever on the 10 of spades with the ace being out there. So like small bets just obviously make no sense for range. We could pause and talk about it. I just don't really want to. I think I'm wasting time. I think these things are like kind of intuitive as well. Okay. Not a particularly high betting frequency on flop, though. Obviously, like flushing cards are going to be advantage for us. And as far as like the bet 3 bets, they'll come from a 9. This hand is just going to be bet deciding on river. Yeah. So not a huge betting frequency on flop for our opponent, and he doesn't really want to be putting in loads. Here's kind of an interesting spot. We're just against a recreational player. Now, recreational players do actually end up spazzing out a little bit more against like 25% pop, but then they like it's kind of weird when you try to exploit Rex, like finding the exact perfect sizing, because these spots are weird as well, to be honest. These spots are very weird, like deciding to bluff this versus a rec or deciding to like check. They're kind of very difficult to decide what we want to do here. Obviously checking river. That is a good note. I could talk about this board more, but whatever. It's basically a spot to just kind of like push the EV of his range and bet like really, really small. Not much of a thing to use big bets, and like not a particularly high betting frequency either. And again, like a 7 is going to be advantage for me. A 4 is going to be advantage of 5, a 3, an 8. The 3 and the 8, because he goes 2.2x, are still going to be advantage for me. If he went like 2.5, they're a lot more neutral. But when he goes 2.2, yeah, just our range is just smashing this area. Not like completely smashing it, but you sort of get the general idea. This is like not a thing, by the way. It's purely having a club, having a spade, my opponent being like on the greedy side, being a little bit. This is like, see, I don't even really want to give away like reads exactly as to why I'm doing things. Like it's kind of like dangerous making a training video. Very high frequency turn check with our range. We actually end up like if he ends up betting like turn too frequently, we can just check all of our good hands and then decide we don't actually need to be. Now, at optimal, we're betting our good hands very frequently, but again, it's just not a necessary thing. Flop mixing it up, but betting very frequently on this particular texture, especially with this combo. But I think challenging our opponents to actually find the right bluffs on turn and not like fuck themselves up and like not use the wrong sizings and all this is not a bad thing. Turn as well, like pretty close either way. Feels pretty close. Don't mind betting, don't mind checking. I roll a bit higher. Again, this is like everybody's like, oh, if you bet the turn is plus EV. Obviously, betting turn is plus EV. Checking turn is plus EV. You sort of need to consider like where your opponents are making mistakes and like how you're going to end up countering your like opponents. Like For instance, I think my opponent is under bluffing the river node, right? I think he perceives my range to be very many hands that are just never folding river. So therefore, I think he's going to significantly to slightly under bluff the river. How does that affect the EV of 8-7? Well, you're clearly. I mean, okay, it's like a bit. You have to assume that all the other nodes are being played perfectly and blah blah blah. Uh, my hand is actually mixing some folds here. It's also mixing a bunch of 4-bet. I roll very high at 99, which is going to be the more passive option. We're folding. If you're not familiar with folding King Jack there, you best get familiar with it, and you best understand like pre-flop in 6 max no limit hold'em. Actually, even high stakes players don't really understand it very well. I've talked with a number of high stakes players and a few people that are top 25 in the world, and they don't really understand pre-flop at the deepest level. Obviously, it's not about theory though. It's like much more about like being able to exploit recreational players and destroy them. Knowing like deep theory about fucking pre-flop is not really a big deal. I mean, I don't know it either, right? I'm just a whale as well, just to be clear. I'm not saying anything bad about whoever. I'm just fucking saying like things are. I'm gonna go with the flop call against a rec. Recs just like to bet flop and just like bluff turn and river way too often. They're just kind of being silly clowns. You could like say, oh, raise turn, but the reality is that Rex just like bluff too often. Here, this is even this is even like slightly thin. I roll a bit high. I'm gonna go with the check back with the ace jack. Turn mixing it up. Essentially, like if my opponents don't find enough slow plays on the turn, and they don't have like, I mean, this is more complicated stuff, right? There are a couple different sizing options that I can use. This is not optimal poker, by the way. This is literally a function of people. This guy probing turn too often, and this guy like just not playing very well. And as a result, I'm going to deviate from an optimal strategy and attempt to exploit him and value bet thinner than I should, and delay more often, delay slightly more often than I should. I don't really care about things like, oh, I'm representing this or that or whatever. I'm just trying to play a good strategy, man. That's all. You say like I will have some all ins there as a bluff. I'll have some all ins for value, blah blah blah. But my hand is kind of like mixing a bunch of stuff, but it's definitely not mixing all in. The blocker for all in is going to be blocking its most frequent like check calls on the turn that are not the nuts, and that's going to be exactly like ace queen. And honestly, I would argue that my opponent has very few to none of those. Like every single node, people are going to be exploitable, and you need to figure out like how they're exploitable. But then at the same time, they themselves will know that they're exploitable, so you can't make everything incredibly obvious. Like that's not really the best approach here. Mixing it up with the ace nine, mostly folding though. Some of the ace six and ace seven get in there for the 3-bet. Decent amount of the ace fives on call. Just a function of basically like having the ace five. If we're going to 4-bet, is kind of like blocking a number of his like 5-4, 5-7 folds. Some of like the ace fives, that sort of stuff. I rolled very low on the turn. I realize there's a wreck in the pot as well. It's like, whatever. I just kind of think that my recreational friend is going to be inclined to call it. I think my opponent to the right has a slightly large ego, but he's probably mostly, I mean, he's almost always folding given the situation, but there's like a certain risk to reward ratio that makes sense in this situation, and that's not one of them. Flop with the king six of spades. Like this is going to be one of my more frequent bets. Given that I actually have the six of spades, I sort of unblock more like the middling space that he can continue. But again, like 61, I still have to mix it up, and because of the fact that I just don't have very many flushes on this texture, it's going to be a spot where I'm playing a very very high frequency check. I block a king that's going to continue. I also roll 93 again. We're just checking back. Obviously, you need to have some amount of these in your turn checking range. Otherwise, your opponent can just go all in, like very thinly, and like with like that's just not how poker works, basically. In this situation, my opponent's not capped. He's actually supposed to be playing like bet three bets on the river, and because of that fact, I don't need to go big with anything in my range. I pretty much, I think I can go like just kind of like 2/3, and then because of that, he gets to have the three bets, and then him having the three bets, I don't need to actually do any big raises. I think range versus range, it doesn't make sense to have big raises there. Obviously, you can like have some fucking like crazy wizardry whatever going on where you just have like, but nah, not really much of a thing. There's deception is a very valuable asset. I'm not talking about like the deception of like some fucking guy that thinks they're being deceptive. I'm actually like talking about like using certain hands to piggyback off of other hands and like it'd be the word is not protected, right? Like saying protected, that's just kind of like something that people say, but it's not really equilibria. But you could kind of sort of say like you're protecting other hands, but again, that's not really reality. Just mixing it up pre-flop with the fives normally against this kind of rec guy. These rec three bet ranges are just quite strong. The value of fives obviously goes up when we're a bit deeper. When you're like, well, yeah, that's another fucking. I don't want to go all into a bunch of pre-flop stuff again and different SPRs and hand values and all this shit. Jesus, that just takes a lot of time and energy, man. Uh, Generally, when like recreational players see bet the flop, they just don't fold enough. This is not really a very great play to be making. The issue is that they end up like barreling turn too often as well and bluffing a lot. And I kind of don't want to check call, but then I also freeze up a bunch of hands that decide to like bet turn. It's like it's not even raising for information. It's just against the 2.5x, people way overcall this. We're still folding like 55% of our range against 2.5x. It's very important. The 2.5x strategy is like it's okay. I don't want to say it's atrocious because that's not quite true. At 200 NL, it's fucking terrible beyond belief, right? Because the rake is so absurdly fucking high. And for all these weak hands in your opponent's range, when you're 3-betting 2.5x, you're just giving them free fucking EV. You're literally just giving them free EV. In addition to that, people don't 4-bet enough. Because of the fact that people do not 4-bet enough, right? You are losing. I mean, I've run all these solutions. I've run this fucking solution for 2.5x optimally with this rake, which is clearly dominated. I've run this 2.5x versus how people actually play preflop, and it's even more disgustingly terrible, right? So the only way to justify it is to say that everybody is absolutely horrible post flop and they don't fold enough and blah blah blah. But the thing is, they already are horrible post flop, and they don't fold enough. So I don't really see the point. Yeah, not really much of a thing. Here we need to end up like having some bluff raises on river. Not very frequent all in, but just mixing it up occasionally. We kind of have like the hearts. The hearts are quite good in terms of like unblocking some bluffs. We block the most frequent like jack X that are going to call the river. We end up making some pocket tens. We even have some slow plays. I think he might end up like going larger on the river with like better hands. And as a result, I think we can even be shoving as weak as something like ace jack because we have like such a large value range. And I'm actually like playing a few too many strong hand like checkbacks here because I think their probing frequency is too high. We need to like dig deep for bluffs. We need to actually find enough bluffs here, not just be this guy that like raises good hands and then doesn't raise bad hands. That's obviously not how you make EV because then people making exploitative folds against us is terrible. We make our money from our good hands. If people are able to make large exploitative folds, we just lose tons and tons of EV. That's no good. I'm going to wrap up this session because I've been going for a little while And honestly, I've just been on rant after rant after rant, and I sort of feel bad for the viewers at this point because I don't think this has been a very good video experience. It's just been like rant, 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 no play. I know people actually just like to watch play. Of course, that's why most people are. Okay, anyways. Yep. Turn. Mixing it up. Having a couple of sizings here makes a bit of sense. The thing is, like, he needs to have, like, if he's not delaying turn enough, we really just need to be front dooring a bunch of Jack X, especially if he's not actually this hand very, very, very high frequency turn bet in a situation where opponent is actually just a little bit too weak and a little bit too ace high heavy, not enough ace king, probably a high frequency of pocket tens, even if he has like roughly the correct amount of trips going on the flop, but then he's like very slightly weighted toward more ace king, playing a semi more reasonable aggressive probing strategy is like decent, because even though he does have strong hands in his range, it's so diluted by someone potentially just having more checks with the ace highs than they're supposed to that it changes the equilibrium entirely. Things are super fucking sensitive. Things are super sensitive. Even if you have the exact amount correct slow plays, if it's not the exact amount correct in terms of like percentage of your range, things change drastically very, 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 very quickly. Very quickly. And I don't think that 200 NL players adjust to those variables enough. Okay, guys, this is AOMISHOT22. Thank you very much for watching, and peace out.